Welcome back, everyone. I'm Bash the Prop Slayer, and in this series, I'm making a cosplay you may recognize as the Flame Hashira from Demon Slayer, Kyojuro of Rengoku. For the first video in this series, I'm starting with the most difficult and time-consuming project of the entire costume, and that's going to be the hair. I bought a costume on Amazon that came with a wig that was included, but I am far from an expert from hairstyling, as you could probably tell from my bald-ass head. Not only that, but Rengoku's spiked yellow locks with the red tips is the most prominent and iconic feature of this character, so any shortcuts taken here would absolutely impact the overall appearance of the finished cosplay. And of course, to make this even more unique, I'm going to be making the entire thing out of EVA foam, so here we go. I started out with a helmet template to act as the base for all the little foam spikes and the strands because I wanted this to fit like a skull cap, and it took 3 attempts to get that right size and shape. After getting the shape right and cutting some ear holes, I used some hot glue on the internal seams to reinforce the shape and make sure it wouldn't split during the heat forming. Next, I sketched and cut out some patterns for the front of the hair, the sideburns, and the spikes that go all along the sides and along the back. And then I traced them onto some 4mm foam, and what you're seeing right now is the front of the spikes. I have them all labeled to go from the front to the back. Number 3 is the backmost, 2 in the middle, and then 1 in the front. And this is them all cut out, and I spent about 3 hours cutting an entire sheet of 2mm foam into these long strands that you'll see later added on as details. And then I used a standing drum on my Dremel to carve out a lot of the little wavy lines on all the pieces and to also soften up the edges on the big pieces. Then I added this V shape on the top of the foam helmet so that you could see the details. They'd be visible when you look past the spikes, and I used contact cement to add the front spikes to the helmet. Actually nicknamed this project the Owl Crown based on how this thing looked unrefined, and because I read somewhere that Rengoku's face and hair resembled that of an owl. I don't remember if that was the manga or just some online forum that I was reading. After all the spiky bits were attached onto the front, I went ahead and added the sideburns and then layered on another piece to go on top just to give it a little bit more dimension. Then I started layering on all of those tiny little EVA foam strands on the top. There's probably an easier way to do this, but the only video I could find to make foam wigs on YouTube was one by Punished Props Academy, and they had a much more straightforward wig design than I did, so some of the techniques were applicable, but not a whole lot of them were. My initial plan to make the top knot on the back was to craft it separately and glue it on later, but pulling back all of that extra length from the top strands looked a lot more natural. And there were plenty of happy little mistakes like this all over the helmet. Like I said, I had no idea what I was doing when I first started making this. And here you can see me adding the small, medium, and large spikes. I ended up cutting extra large spikes, but I didn't use them just because they would have stuck out a little bit too much, and there wasn't a whole lot of room. I first pinned them to the helmet to gauge the placement. Then once I figured out where I was going to put them all, I went ahead and used a pencil to trace their rough position on the foam helmet. And then I went ahead and just glued them on. To fill in the back of the head and all the gaps in between all of the spiky bits, I glued in more of those 2mm foam strands. And I did do this in a layering kind of fashion, so I started out with long ones, then went all the way from the top to the bottom. But what you didn't see off camera is I added a couple of short ones that came from behind the spikes as well as in between all of them. Alright, so it's July and it is incredibly hot where I live, but that's no excuse to not wear some safety equipment and get out there and get some sanding done. It's my least favorite any part of cosplay building, but it is always worth it in the end. Here you can see just how much more details and dimension that got added from the sanding. And the next part after the sanding was to trim off some of those a little bit longer strands. This was a rough trim, and you'll see why in a second. I'm going to use these dumbbells here to heat shape most of these so that there's kind of like an outward flare. So when I go to wear this on my head, they're not just sitting, the strands aren't just resting on my shoulders, they're actually going to flare out a little bit, sort of like Rengoku's hair. And if you look closely enough, this heat gun, not only is it heat forming it so that it kind of sticks outward, but it's also shrinking the foam and doing that little bit of heat treat at the same time. And after that heat treat's done, you can go in and snip away all the extra long strands that I kept on there just out of abundance of caution. After I got done trimming off all of the excess, I went back into some of the thicker strands and I cut in sort of this split ends kind of look. So instead of attaching 1.5 million little strands, instead I could just focus on big ones and then cut them to shape a little bit later. And I didn't do this to all of them, I just did it to the ones that you could really plainly see from the outside. It was still quite a bit of trimming, but like I said, any little bit of detail that you do, whether it be sanding or trimming or any extra little care that you put into your project, it's really going to show in the end. Alright, the last thing I did before paint was to seal this whole thing in a mixture of Mod Podge, Flex Bond, and Elmer's glue, and I did mix in a little bit of water. There's no science behind this. The only reason why I did this was because all three of the bottles were kind of at the end, and I needed a lot of glue to cover this project several times over. It looks like I only do one coat, but I actually did an extra coat off camera. And then for the third coat, I did a live stream that you can also find on my channel, where I'm talking you through a lot of the other processes that I just kind of ran out of time to do during this video. And this part of the process did get quite messy. You could probably see on the table at the end of the video that there is just glue everywhere. And that happened because all of these strands, the back, the front, the sides, in between all of the little creases, every little bit of that had to get saturated with glue. Because if you don't pay attention to your sealing techniques, when you do move on to painting, you're going to see a lot of splotching, a lot of unevenness, and it's going to take a lot more layers of paint to get a nice even coat versus getting it sealed properly the first time. And that's the end of part 1 for Rengoku's hair, helmet, wig, headpiece thing. So thanks for sticking around. Be sure to subscribe if you want to hit the notification bell so that you know when part 2 comes out, which is going to cover all the painting process. And I'll see you next time.